want to welcome everyone to tonight's event. We're glad you chose to join us this evening with so much going on around campus and in Athens. So it means a lot that you chose to be here with us. Many thanks to the Menard family and the Phil and Pat Muck family for making this event possible. My name is Court Rodet. I serve as director of the Menard Family George Washington Forum and associate professor of economics. And for those of you who might be unfamiliar with the George Washington Forum, I wanted to share a bit about what we do. Our program works towards promoting curiosity and inquiry among Ohio University students and faculty and our fellow community members here in Athens and beyond. And we do this through our speaker series, like an event tonight, as well as our undergraduate fellowship program, which includes participation in a biweekly reading group throughout the academic year and a capstone travel program that combines rigorous academic seminars, taking in local history and networking opportunities. So in the springtime is when calls go out for applications. So an invitation to keep your eye out if you are an undergraduate student here at OU. We're always looking for curious students who want to contribute to our search for understanding. So this year, we're studying aspects of the Enlightenment and its role in the Industrial Revolution and the subsequent Great Enrichment, and how these events have shaped and continue to shape the human condition. And by understanding the intellectual, social, political, and economic history, and by pondering philosophical questions about meaning, value, justice, and what makes for a rich life, we hope to gain insight into the current state of the world and understand how we might contribute to its improvement. So I won't go on too much longer. I want to introduce our speaker. We are very fortunate to have Professor Mokyr here with us this evening. He's the Robert H. Strotz Professor of Economics at Northwestern University and has a long list of accolades. I'll share just a few. He conducts research on economic history of Europe, specializes in the period of 1750 to 1914. His current research is concerned with the understanding of the economic and intellectual roots of technological progress and the growth of useful knowledge in European societies, as well as the impact that industrialization and economic progress have had on economic welfare. Please help me welcome Professor Mokyr.
Yes. Thank you very much, Gordy, and I'm honored and delighted to be here. I have a soft spot in my heart for the Menard family, which has also been supporting the Center for Economic History at Northwestern for the last 5 years, and so the more the better, one would say. So I have almost 100 slides. I'm not going to get through all of them, but we should go straight to the point. Okay, so this is based on joint work with two co-conspirators. Both happen to be Irish for reasons that I can explain later on. But let's get going. So here is something that basically I suppose everybody knows, which is modern economic growth that has made us rich and made us live longer basically started in the 18th century. In fact, I tell my students, only half tongue-in-cheek, that everything worth talking about in history happened in the 18th century. But it started with the Industrial Revolution. I'll say something about it, but I'm not going to explain it too much because that would take me too far off my main topic. But what it did, of course, is it created what is known as the Great Divergence. It created this huge gap between the West and the West, so to speak. And certainly by, say, 1914 or thereabout, that gap is in place. We have this this club of rich nations, and then the rest of the world is still mired into poverty. But of course, eventually, the rest of the world, too, is experiencing economic growth. Most of it is far richer than they were in 1750, but of course, it happened much later. But what is striking, of course, is that this divergence, which is known as the Great Divergence, really isn't just a divergence. What it is, it's a reversal. Because, at some point, Europe was the backward place. Certainly around the year, say, 1000, Europe was backward compared to the great Asian civilizations of the Middle East, India, and China. And so it's more than just a divergence, it's a reversal. And so if you put a gun to my head and said, look, give me in one word the origin and causes of this divergence, this reversal, and the great enrichment of the world, in one word, what would that word be? And this is the answer. It's useful knowledge. Now, it's an 18th century term that I have adopted from people writing it at that time. It's not used all that much today, and people always say, what do you mean useful? And also, but basically, what it means is this sort of superset of science and technology with a few things, extra things thrown in if you want. And the reason, and I need to explain this because this is important, the reason why useful knowledge is the key to modern economic growth is not because the only way of generating economic growth, which it is not, but because it's the only one that doesn't suffer from what I call the curse of concavity, which is economies. And every economist will know what this means, and people who are not economists won't. And so what it really means, it's a fancy way of saying that all other forms of economic growth eventually run into diminishing returns and peter out, right? So you can go through economic trade, as we have known since the 18th century. Adam Smith pointed this out, of course, so did many others. But eventually, trade will, the gains from trade will start petering out as two economies get more and more integrated. And at some point, you reach a point where the gains become completely marginal and eventually asymptotically go to zero. The same is true, of course, obviously, by capital accumulation. You accumulate capital, you'll get richer, but as we have known forever, if you increase one factor and all the other ones constant, you run into diminishing returns. So this is what we call concavity. And the curse of concavity really means that all these forms of growth will eventually peter out. Growth of useful knowledge, invention, discoveries, does not. Now, I'm stating this as a fact. Of course, I don't know this fact. All I know is that in the past, the world in history had been full of people who said, everything that can be invented has been invented, and then they turn out to be completely wrong. One of those people who be saying this is my learned Northwestern colleague, Robert Gordon. There's in a book about this, and I told him he was wrong, and it turned out to be correct about that. But of course, we don't know for sure that, 1,000 years from now, if the planet is still there, then we will not eventually run into diminishing returns. There's no way of knowing that. So far, it hasn't happened. Now, when was the gap of knowledge between the West and the rest in place? Well, here is a quotation that was written almost exactly on the eve of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution started now, or is it agreed by historians to have started roughly around 1760. And here is a quote from 1759. So that's pretty close. This is from a book by a famous English intellectual called Dr. Samuel Johnson. And he has this book about this fictional Abyssinian prince. It's kind of a crazy book, but in it, there's a very, very interesting passage. Because this Prince Raslas, is a friend of the philosopher, and much of it, the book is sort of conversations between the two. And he asked this is a guy, Abyssinian, basically what we would call today Ethiopian, right? This is the 18th century term. He says, but by what means are the Europeans thus powerful? Or why, since they can so easily visit Asia and Africa for trade or conquest, cannot the Asiatics and Africans invade their coasts, plant colonies in their ports? The same winds, after all, that carried them back would bring us thither. And the answer that the philosopher gives was this: they are more powerful than we are, because they are wiser. Knowledge will always predominate over ignorance. But why their knowledge is more than ours, I know not. So, in a way, I'm trying to answer the question that this guy Imlach, this philosopher, asks here. Why is it that Europeans, by that time, have developed this gap in knowledge? And so, to basically get started, this is, as I said, is a fairly recent phenomenon. If you go back, say, to the Middle Ages, say around 1250 or something like that, most of these big Asian civilizations were far more advanced than Europe. By 1850 or 1900, it's been reversed. So what drove the reversal? And so I have come up with this term, which I call the industrial Enlightenment, which I'd like to explain a little bit, talk a little bit about today. It's been over 20 years since I first launched it and using it ever since. It's a bit of a misnomer, of course, because it isn't just about industry any more than the Industrial Revolution is only about industry. So the word industry is probably not quite right, but it conveys the notion. And the question is, how should we think of this concept? And why should economists be interested at all in the Enlightenment and in similar cultural matters? So, to start off, I really do believe that the Enlightenment is a pivotal historical event, comparable in its importance, say, to the emergence of monotheistic religions or something along those lines. It really was a massive departure from the past. So here are two views of two very well-known scholars who we have probably very little else to share, okay? This is from Michel Foucault. I never thought I'd end up for an audience and citing Foucault, but here I am. And so he says, what then is this event that is called the Aufklärung? That's the German word for enlightenment. And it has determined, at least in part, what we are, what we think, and what we do today. Here is a quote from a very well-known historian of the Enlightenment, Anthony Pagden. He says, no topic of historical debate has accessed anything like the whole which the Enlightenment does over the ideological divisions of the modern world. Okay, so this is clearly a pivotal event or a defining moment, if you want. The other pivotal event, as I already alluded to, is the Industrial Revolution, which is a game-changing turning point in economic history. All right. So, both of them happening in the 18th century. Now, the exact timing, of course, is a matter of some debate, but we can sort of agree that there's not much there, say, in 1650, and by 1750, they're both clearly part of the European scene and continue to have an effect. Now, just looking at it from the outside, you'd say, well, it would be a coincidence of almost beyond belief. The two events this momentous, occurring at almost the same time and more or less the same places, would be unrelated. It's also a question of, how would you think of if you think they're related, which one is causing which? And I think the evidence, such as it is, would suggest that it's probably the Enlightenment predates the Industrial Revolution. We can trace it back certainly to the closing decades of the 17th century. The Industrial Revolution really doesn't start in earnest until the middle of the 18th. So it doesn't seem likely that the Industrial Revolution drove the Enlightenment. The other way around is better. So what is it really about the Enlightenment that may have been so important to the Industrial Revolution? Well, here something I can rule out. It's not because of this guy. So this is, many of you will recognize this man. This is often associated mostly with the Enlightenment. This is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was, of course, not at all an Enlightenment figure. He was a counter-Enlightenment figure. It's a debate worth having, but everybody sort of thinks of Rousseau as being a pivotal figure in the Enlightenment. He really wasn't, He was a very important intellectual, but he was, I think, a reactionary more than anything else. But we can have that debate later on. Now, the problem with the Enlightenment, and I've been spending the last 2 decades of thinking about it, it's a huge cultural tint. It is so large that it's hard for it to be any use unless you start taking it apart and unpacking it in some way. And some scholars, like Pocock, for instance, basically said we should get rid of the concept altogether. The alternative would be, I think, to slice it up in useful sort of subcategories. You could do this, for instance, by geography. People do Scottish Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment, the English Enlightenment, the Dutch Enlightenment, the Northern Italian Enlightenment, and so on and so forth. Or you could do it by topic, like the scientific Enlightenment and the religious Enlightenment. musical enlightenment, believe it or not. Another one is to look at the enlightenment of a set of themes, the belief in reason, which is often associated with enlightenment, the radical enlightenment versus the moderate enlightenment, that's, Jonathan Israel's big thing, or, what it is that society is all about, like Roy Porter and more recently Richie Roberts on the left argued, what the Enlightenment really is about is for the first time people dared to say that the purpose of society is the pursuit of happiness. And that's a radical change, because in the Middle Ages, what people are really all about is the salvation of the soul, right? That says happiness didn't matter because salvation of the soul was much more important. Well, the 18th century, basically, people are much more explicit coming out saying happiness matters. So maybe we should do that. And so the idea of slicing the Enlightenment in categories like the one I propose seems to have caught on. So here are 3 recent books that have come out. One is called the Medical Enlightenment, one is called the Agricultural Enlightenment, and one is called the Artisanal Enlightenment. These are all books that have come out the last, 20 years or so. And basically, I think they, much like me, think that this is another useful way of slicing up the Enlightenment. Nothing but all of it, but just this particular part that matters. So if you look at these different things, what is the common denominator? So I'm going to propose this. It's the belief in progress. So it's not just that it's about the pursuit of happiness. It is about the belief that we can actually make society a better place, make the world a better place. Now, progress, of course, itself is problematic, and we're not for a minute denying that. What kind of progress exactly? And equally important, progress for whom? And so an economist, and I can't help being one, basically says, well, I have the answer to that, okay? I don't know how to make maybe people happy, all that, but I do know poverty doesn't help. And so an increase in material welfare seems to be an attractive way of measuring progress. And, a modern economist, of course, eventually will make the jump to GDP per capita or something like that, but I am willing to leave that open. But there is a sense in the late 17th and 18th century that progress is possible, that it is desirable, and that useful knowledge is the key to it. And that is really what I want to talk about. And so this is, of course, realized at the time. And Immanuel Kant, one of the sort of towering figures of the Enlightenment, basically was asked, what is the Enlightenment? And he said, it's what he said in Latin, sapere aude, meaning dare to know, okay? And then the question, of course, is knowledge of what? And that, as I said, is what I call useful knowledge, essentially science and technology. So let me take 2 minutes for a brief digression to point out that the belief in progress is itself a radical departure, and it's very much part of the early stages of the Enlightenment. Now, when we can go on about talking about this, there's very little evidence that the ancient Greeks or Romans, or for that matter, their Chinese counterparts across the continent, believed in progress. Most of it, insofar as they thought about history, most of these historians basically see history as cycles of things going up, things going down, but not any kind of a trend. So there's some debate in the statement of Seneca. I'm going to skip this, but basically the idea is that there's something very counterintuitive about progress. And one of my colleagues pointed out to me that intuitively it's hard to really feel progress happening because the second law of thermodynamics works against it, right? Things wear out. Entropy grows. Things break and crumble. We get older and our body goes wrong. And things like that. Things rarely get better by themselves. Things get worse. And, of course, the next stage is our forefathers were smarter than we are. That actually is a very, very important theme in human history. There is an instinctive notion somehow that great wisdom was revealed in the past, and that every civilization has its prophets or its great philosophers that everybody thought, oh, this is the smartest person alive, so if you want to know something, look it up in this person. Now, that person, of course, is varied across civilizations, medieval civilization, probably, certainly in the later part, would be Aristotle. In Middle East, it would be the Quran and the Hadith. In China, it would be the writings of Zhu Qi, the great Song Dynasty philosopher, and so on and so forth. This is actually quite natural because, our society, sort of education system, essentially has it got it built in. So if you spend 6 years studying medicine, then you're going to be resistant to progress, because what you learn in medical school, people tell you, well, this is all wrong, but that's, you're going to resist that, right? I spent 6 years slaving over those books and I'm told it's all wrong. And the same is true across the board in engineering, in material science, and so forth. So there is a built-in conservatism in knowledge and backward looking. It's particularly remarkable in Jewish culture. So Jewish culture is a good case in point. It goes back 3,000 years, and there's no concept of progress in Jewish culture. Basically, the only progress that ultimately happens is when the Messiah comes, and until then, things are constantly bad. But there's something deeper than that. There is a belief in Jewish culture that the truth was revealed many generations ago. And ever since there's something called the decline of generations. In Hebrew, Yeridat Adorot. Basically, things go downhill ever since. And there is a very nice Mishnaic dictum that says, if those who were before us were like angels, we are like men. And those who were before us were like men, we are like asses. That captures this inferiority complex relative to earlier generations. Now, this inferiority complex in Europe starts falling apart in sort of what we call the early modern period. And the sense starts to grow that, wait a minute now, there is a good argument to be made about progress. And the argument that's made about progress is that knowledge is cumulative. And so people pointed out, for instance, that we know more than Aristotle because we can learn everything that he wrote, but he can't read what we wrote. This is pointed out by a guy called Fontenelle, the French believer in progress. And so knowledge is inevitably cumulative, and therefore it is growing. And so now, of course, knowledge isn't always cumulative. It can be lost, and it has been lost, and in many cases in which it is lost. But that becomes very unlikely in early modern Europe for a very simple reason, and that's the printing press. Because when somebody, writes a book with some discovery, some invention, some idea, in the past, the book, there were a few copies extant, and if the last copy is lost, the knowledge might be lost. But with the printing press, each book is printed in hundreds and hundreds of identical copies, and the probability that they all get lost or the single one survives is vanishingly small. And so basically the printing press guarantees in some ways that knowledge is cumulative. The other thing, of course, that happens in this period are the great voyages. The great voyages basically showed that much of the wisdom of the ancient Greeks was just wrong. And in many dimensions, Europeans start discovering how many things were wrong. You could sail across the equator without being burned to death, as Aristotle had said. Spontaneous generation of life doesn't exist. There always has to be some kind of seed. On and on and on. In astronomy, in medicine, new things were discovered that showed that what ancient writers, all the way from Aristotle down to the great doctors like Galenus, they was just wrong. And people start saying, you know what? These guys didn't know everything. They were smart. We're smarter. That is the concept of progress. And so they also felt that it happened in the past. So here are three of the most notable intellectuals of the of the 18th century. As it happens, they're all British, but I could easily find French and German to say the same thing. But here's David Hume, and he says, he talks about the spirit of the age, in which he says they rouses the minds of man from their lethargy and puts them in a fermentation to carry improvement into every art and science. Art, of course, he means essentially skill. Here's Joseph Priestley, one of my great heroes of the age, and you can read this yourself. All things, whatever depends, have of late been in a quicker progress toward perfection than ever. The wisdom of one generation will be the folly of the next one. So this is in 1771. He writes this. So this is, smack in the middle of the Enlightenment. And of course, the great Adam Smith himself has a famous passage about economic progress, in which he says that the annual produce, which is essentially equivalent to GNP, is greater at the time of his writing than it was a century before, and then it was, and so on and so forth. So people actually believed that this was not just possible, but that it was actually happening. There was nothing inevitable about this, of course, and some people disagreed. So Hume, in particular, basically pointed out that this was very contingent, that this could go wrong on many levels, but that it was happening. All right. And so this debate, which the French called the querelle des anciens et des modernes, the struggle between the ancient people looking back and thinking, the ancient Greeks knew it all, and the modern, which is essentially people writing at that time. By 1700, ladies and gentlemen, this debate is over. Nobody believes anymore, that the Earth is in the center of the universe, and we make the list infinitely long. And so this sense of inferiority to vis-a-vis earlier generation has disappeared, I would say, almost everywhere in Europe by 1700. And I think that is very much part and parcel of the Industrial Enlightenment, the belief in progress through useful knowledge. So here's some evidence for you. This is from very, very, very straightforward. This is a Google Books Ngram viewer, and this is sort of three concepts that I pulled out. One is the green line is progress. And I also threw in improvement and betterment, which is at the time. And you can sort of see it starts to rise in the middle of the 17th century. Then there's sort of an early a decline. But by the time of the Industrial Revolution, a little bit before maybe, it starts to rise and actually keeps rising deep until the 19th century. The same is true about knowledge and science. Here I would discount this because actually the number of books is fairly small. But you see that the sharp increase happens at some point in the sort of after 1720, and the same is true a little bit later, maybe for wealth, riches, and prosperity. But in all of those areas, you see at least that the words appearing in books, which is what engrams, of course, do, that they actually start to come up more or less in the decades prior to the Industrial Revolution. Now, that's not proof by a long shot, but it indicates that there may be something here. That's probably the best we can do. So, these graphs do raise some problems. Why does it go down before it goes up? We can talk about that, but I'm going to skip this. And so, what about then the Industrial Revolution? The Industrial Revolution took place in Britain, ladies and gentlemen. Everybody knows that. It's something unusual about the British Enlightenment that helped generate Britain's technological precocity. So, I've been studying this, and there's something quite interesting. The English Enlightenment, particularly English, a bit more than the British perhaps, it shares with the continental Enlightenment the belief in the possibility and the desirability of progress. precisely because in many ways Britain has already shed many of the elements of the ancien regime, of the sort of reactionary conservative government that one sees in France and in Prussia and in Spain and so on. It can focus on the kind of progress that's much more practical and useful in the sense that I used it earlier. And so it's an enlightenment, as somebody wrote. It's an enlightenment of nuts and bolts, of pulleys and belts, of cogs and springs, of things that actually work, machinery and chemicals and instruments. That is what these people want to improve in order to achieve social progress. And so Roy Porter, who wrote about this a whole bunch of books, basically says it embodied a philosophy experiencing a dedication to the art, science, and duty of living well in the here and now. And I think that is quite interesting. And so, if you look at the continent, what are these continental philosophers writing about? Generalizing this is, of course, absurd, but I think the themes are predominantly, things like morals and morality, behavior, a lot of talk about religion, civil society, institutions, how rulers and citizens should relate to each other, freedom of conscience and expression, distribution of resources, of course. Now, it's not that the British aren't writing about this. It feels less acute. What they really want to do is solve practical problems. Here are 3 practical problems that they solve. How do you pump water out of mines? Well, that doesn't sound nearly as weighty as, as the relationship between, church and king, or between, whether aristocracy should run a country. It's a very, well-focused, pragmatic problem, but they direct their intellectual resources on solving it, and they do. That's what early steam engines did. They pumped water out of mines. How do we determine longitude at sea? Again, very practical, sort of mundane problem. But, this is critical. You're a seafaring nation like Britain. You can only measure latitude. You can't measure longitude. That is a problem. And they lost a lot of ships. Eventually, in the century, more, it's the same in the middle of the century, they cracked the problem. And longitude, there's John Harrison's clock. Or how do we prevent smallpox? Again, a very practical problem. This age is obsessed by smallpox. For good reason. It's a terrible disease. And then nobody had a clue of what to do about it. And then eventually, somebody says, aha, I got it. Vaccination. Again, happens in England. So these are issues. I could multiply these examples many times. But that is what English thinkers, who I think of as being enlightened, thinking about. Okay, it's not Montesquieu, but it is making life better in definable ways. So basically, what the Industrial Enlightenment then is an agenda of how to increase useful knowledge and how to deploy it to foster economic growth. And that requires 2 things. And that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the talk. The first is the creation of new useful knowledge requires incentives. Okay, this is the economist talking. You want people to do something, give them an incentive, give them a reason to do so. The second is, of course, once the knowledge is there, somebody has to have access to it. Okay? If the knowledge is sitting in some dusty drawer, okay, then it doesn't do any good. You have to disseminate it. You have to diffuse it. And so, let me talk about these 2 in sequence. So first talk about incentives. And so, knowledge, as economists have realized basically forever, is a funny kind of good. It's a good in the sense that it is costly to produce and valuable, but it has all kind of funny properties that normal goods don't have, right? It is non-rivalrous in the sense that if I give you some of mine, I don't have any less. It's unlike pizza, and I give you a slice, I have less pizza. But if I know something and I give it to you, I don't have any less. That's non-rival standard property. The other thing is hard to exclude. So, if I own a house, I can tell you not to come in. But if I have some knowledge, I can't exclude you from getting it unless I don't tell anybody. But once I tell somebody, it's out there and I can't stop it from using it. There are also substantial externalities. I talk about that as well. But basically, it's sort of the mother of all market failures. It's the market for knowledge, okay? Because it had all these funny properties. Now, the people writing in Industrial Enlightenment, of course, clearly recognize this and suggested various ways of overcoming these incentive problems. Because if you don't overcome them, society will systematically underproduce useful knowledge, or may not even produce any of it, as so many other societies existed. So, to see how this worked, I want to make a brief distinction, which is the distinction between what I call propositional knowledge, which is basically, you could think of it as science. This is basically knowledge of what, okay, so describing the world, looking for regularities and law, and prescriptive knowledge, which is knowledge of how. And you should think of this as like recipes, how to make, a pile of steel or a bushel of wheat, or, cure or set a broken bone. These are sort of do this and then do that and then do that. So it's what technology is really all about. So this is not my distinction. I borrowed this from the epistemologists, but it seems to work reasonably well. So you think of propositional knowledge, and as I said, it's discovering things that are already there. This is from this philosopher called Michael Polanyi. And what he points out, among others, is that one of the interesting things is that propositional knowledge, science, is not really recognized by intellectual property rights. Okay, so you cannot take a patent on an idea. Now, that's the last decade that has become a little bit blurry and a little bit murky, but by and large, at that time, it was very clear. You could not take a patent on an idea. You could only take patent on a technique or on a recipe. So how do we really incentivize intellectual innovators, philosophers, and astronomers and mathematicians, people who didn't invent anything, but who added to knowledge? And what the centuries before the Industrial Revolution, but particularly the 17th and 18th century, realize how important patronage is. And you look at the leading intellects of the age, and the vast bulk of them, after they come up with some famous and important idea, they get patronage jobs. So some of the more famous examples, of course, is Galileo's appointment to be court philosopher at the Grand Duke of Florence, or Newton's appointment to become master of the mint. And look at, can make these things ever. So these are the absolute plum jobs. But many of the lesser-known people, who are still important, became tutors to the children of rich and powerful people. They became court physicians. A large proportion of them actually had medical degrees. They become members of academies. Some of them become tenured professors, which is an ultimate patronage job. And some of them, of course, become real celebrities. Guys like Newton and Leibniz, became real celebrities, and they became, reasonably wealthy as well. So that's probably exceptional. And so what society realizes that it's actually you can incentivize these people by catering to their egos. I know this is going to come as a shock to you that academics and intellectuals have egos, but what they realized is that many of these rewards are very cheap. And some of them are completely non-pecuniary. You give people medals. And, so that is so for instance, here you have the Copley Medal. It's established in 1736. The Rumford Medal, 1799. University chairs. established fairly early on. These are the so-called Regius professorship in England and so on and so forth. Our own age, of course, has discovered this in spades, and we have endless of these sort of cheap or non-pecuniary awards, one of which, of course, is given out this week, as you all know. Now, it's not completely cheap, it's $1 million, but, the Nobel Prize is sort of the ultimate of these prizes, but there below it, there's this vast pyramid of various awards and rewards that we give to academics, most of which are financially either very small or non-existent, but they are important to them, and therefore they incentivize them. That, I think, is something that this age recognized far more than any other. So there was some of that in ancient Rome, I must say, but it didn't really big enough to do anything. The other thing, of course, is, and this is point made by analysts in particular, is essentially people want peer recognition. Now, these signals help, but peer recognition, as a theory of moral sentiments pointed out, is really something that's really, you want a reputation, but more than anybody, you want a reputation about people who are like you. Okay, so you want your colleagues or your people, co-members of the academy, you want them to think highly of you. You know what your next door neighbor thinks is nice, but that is not what people really care about. So that too is an incentive. And finally, of course, there's a whole bunch of what's so-called intrinsic incentives. Okay, curiosity is one of them. People just want to study nature because they want to know. At that time, and this is, of course, a famous hypothesis associated with the great Robert Merton, the great sociologist of the 20th century. And the Merton thesis basically says it's religion. And you'd think, hey, wait a minute, how does a religion come in here? And what the Merton thesis basically argues is that the Puritans, and you could include, and he wasn't really a Puritan, but you could include Newton into this, they study nature for a religious reason. And the idea is basically that God is so inscrutable you can't understand God ever. But what you can understand is what God does and what God has made, and then understand his wisdom through studying the creation and showing the logic of the universe, which, of course, Newton and Robert Boyle and people like that did in spades. And so that, too, is an incentive. I'm not sure how much of that is still important today, but curiosity surely is. And people who have long ago, given up on any kind of financial reward still end up doing research. Why? When you ask me, they say it's fun. Why is it fun? Because you're curious. You want to know. Whatever it is that you are researching you want to know the answer. It's a bit like, almost like solving a crossword puzzle, except that this has real social benefits. All right. So, what about prescriptive knowledge? What about technology? Now, by its very definition, you would expect this, right? So, it's far more biased towards financial incentives. People invent things, at least in part, because they want to get rich. And so the concept of intellectual property rights emerges a little bit before, the first time that we can see it is in 15th century, but it really comes onto its own really in the 18th century. It is recognized as a key to progress. But what is interesting is that this is a European idea. I have not found any evidence that anything like intellectual property rights emerged in China. I've looked. In fact, other scholars have looked, and I've read them, and they say it isn't there, so I give up. They start adopting intellectual property rights when they learn it from the Europeans in the sort of waning days of the empire and the republic. But until then, the idea that, an invention is in some sense an asset, a property, didn't get there. And could talk about why that was so, but it's a very European kind of thing. And so the patent system, of course, isn't originally meant to encourage invention. It's first basically a way for government to raise money, they will give you, because a patent is a monopoly after all, right? And this is an age that isn't very fond of monopolies, but for the king to give somebody a monopoly usually was a good deal for both him and the patentee, not so much for their customers, of course, but that is how it is. And but over time, people in the 18th century start recognizing that this is a good way of incentivizing and encouraging innovation, because you give people an incentive. And the nice thing about a patent, of course, is, and this is what Adam Smith has pointed out in his famous passages on the patent system in his lectures on jurisprudence, he says, it isn't enough to invent something new. It has to be potentially useful, and it has to meet a market test. So if I give you a patent, I don't give you any money. I give you the right to exploit this insight. And if people want to buy it and pay you for it, okay, you make money. If they don't, if it's useless, if the market decides, I don't want this, you don't make any money. Which is different from in France, in which basically you have a committee of people who look at a patent. They decide whether it's any good, and if they do, they'll give you a pension, which before the revolution. And so, and that incentivizes things as well, but it doesn't incentivize them in proportion to how the market evaluates them. That makes a big, big difference. And so that, I think, is very much part of the industrial Enlightenment. The idea that incentivizing invention will lead to social progress. And what is interesting is that, both within, I think, 2 years, both the United States and France, after their revolutions, one of the first things they do is introduce a patent system. And of course, by the 19th century, almost every European country has one under the influence of the French Revolution. Now, here's something which is sort of quite neat about the patent system. You see, when you file for a patent, you actually have to not just say, I want a patent, you have to describe the patent in great detail. So there's a full specification of how it is. And you deposit that in the appropriate office, which in England is the Court of Chancery, and basically these offices are open. So by filing for a patent, you give up the right of secrecy. Okay? You agree to full disclosure. Now, you could decide not to patent it and keep it secret. There are some inventions where keeping it secret, you can make more money than if you file a patent, Coca-Cola being the classic example, but there are many others. But most people actually decided if they were going to had a good patent, patenting would be the thing to do. In England, you had problems. I'll probably have no time to talk about that. But basically, this is very much part of it. Now, whether these intellectual property rights themselves are crucial to the Industrial Revolution or not is very much in dispute, ladies and gentlemen. There's a literature about this. It's long and complicated. It's probably, on balance, more favorable than unfavorable, but its effect probably wasn't very large. And one reason to sort of drive that home is to realize that actually most important inventions were never patented. For various reasons, some of them because people said, I don't want to patent this because I want this to benefit society, but also because patents in England, in particular, are very expensive. So it's been estimated that something like 1 out of every 6 major inventions was probably patented, no more than that. So 5 out of 6 were not. Now, the question is, of course, does that actually reflect the importance of the patent system? And the answer probably is no. What happens is something slightly more subtle. That's this. Most patents that were filed cost a lot of money, but didn't yield any returns because people wouldn't buy the product, or it didn't work properly, or whatnot. But there were a few spectacular cases in which a patent made somebody extremely rich. James Watt and his patent on the steam engine is, of course, the best example. A man called Charles Tennant, Scotsman, who invented bleaching powder in the 1790s, patented and became super rich. Richard Arkwright, the great cotton spinner, also became quite rich. Also, his patent protection just sort of eventually failed. But for the average inventor, the returns were negative. And the question is, so why did anybody do it? And of course, the answer is for the same reason that people buy lottery tickets, which is they hope against hope that they will be the lucky one. Okay? But most people at the time realized that. So, here is one name you'll recognize. This is Charles Babbage, sometimes known as the father of the computer. And he talks in 1830, long before it was reformed. He called it a fraudulent lottery, which gives its blanks to genius and its prizes to knaves. I mean, there's a curmudgeon, I think, but there's a lot of people who felt that way. But the easy thing is this: it isn't quite a lottery, right? You think about a patent, and they're different from a lottery in the following sense. If you are buying a lottery ticket, you know full well that whoever you are and whatever you did, you don't have a better chance of winning than anybody else who buys a lottery ticket. Okay? Because it's a completely random process. Now, some people think they can cheat by picking numbers that reflects their birthday or some, garbage like that. But everybody knows that this doesn't work. But with a patent, it's different. Every invention, by definition, is different from any other invention. If it wasn't, it wouldn't be an invention. And so people think, I know the chances aren't very good, but my invention is so much better. And so, again, I go back to the great Adam Smith. Here's what he says: the overweening conceit which the greater part of men have of their own abilities, the chance of gain is by every man more or less overvalued, and the chances of loss undervalued. In other words, people try to patent things even though the odds are against it because they think their patent is better. And so what this actually tells you is that the patent system was a good deal for the British economy, even it was a very bad deal for inventors. And so in that unintended way, I would think this institution strongly correlated, of course, with the Industrial Enlightenment, contribute to the Industrial Revolution by incentivizing invention, even if it wasn't quite in the way that they intended. I think it's kind of a striking statement. All right, so that's half the story. Here's the other half. Knowledge is, of course, not going to be very useful if it's not known, if it isn't accessible, and if it can't be deployed and harnessed for economic uses. So what are access costs? Well, knowledge may be out there somewhere in society, but you have to spend time and effort and maybe money to get to it. Now, in our own age, technology has sort of reduced access costs to almost nothing because we have, Google and ChatGPT and all these other things. But then in earlier times, you often had to, search for it. You had to hire a consultant. You had to correspond with people, and on and on and on. So their things are expensive. Now, why is access so important? Well, this seems almost banal to point it out. First, you want to give manufacturers and producers in general access to best practice science. Well, that's important. Today, in 18th century, I have to say, best practice science was kind of a mixed bag, and a lot of it probably wasn't terribly helpful, but it was getting more so. Okay? It tells innovators, both inventors and scientists, on whose shoulders should they stand, to use Newton's famous statement. It also, particularly in invention, it's important because a lot of invention isn't actually coming up with something wholly new, but it consists of a recombination and hybridization of different components, each of which was invented earlier, okay? So you look at the automobile or the bicycle or something like that. I mean, nobody actually invents a bicycle. It's different insights, from mechanics and from, rubber tire chemicals, things like that are put together and finally put together in the right way. So in order to build a good bicycle or a good airplane, you need to know, the earlier inventions of things that were become components. Of course, you want to avoid reinventing the wheel, so you want to avoid duplication, and you want to not try to invent, the perpetuum mobile, or other things that are dead-end research because they can't be done. And finally, I think a lot of science is actually carried out in an attempt to solve technological problems. So the engineers and the chemists come to the scientists and say, look, I have this problem. Would you kindly help me solve it? And that may direct the scientist of working into some direction. That, too, is a wonderful 18th century idea. There's a famous letter written by an English industrialist called Josiah Wedgwood, famous potter, everyone's heard of Josiah Wedgwood. And Josiah Wedgwood had some kind of problem with a lacquer that he was trying to use, never mind the details, which he couldn't solve. He tried everything, couldn't solve it. So he writes a letter to Antoine Lavoisier, the greatest chemist of the age, and says, look, I got this problem. How do I solve it? Well, we don't have the letter as Antoine Lavoisier wrote back, if he did. But the idea is that, for a manufacturer to make progress, he needs to have access to people who know stuff. And that, I think, is critical. So, what determines access cost? Well, to some extent, it's technology, of course. The printing press is a major step forward in access costs. So is, Google, obviously, and so on and so forth. But in this age, particularly 18th century, I would point to networking and social capital being equally important. You got to know people so that you can ask them questions. And this was proposed a long time ago by a man called Edward Zilsel, so I have to give him credit. But we have actually evidence that this was happening beyond Wedgwood. So you look at, and here we have the whole correspondence. So the great James Watt, the premier engineer of his time, had a very copious correspondence with the two leading chemists of the time, Joseph Black and John Robison, both who were living in Scotland, where one, of course, was originally from. So philosophers learned from artisans, and artisans and craftsmen learned from philosophers. That's also part of access. So what the Industrial Enlightenment actually fostered and encouraged at all kinds of levels is a communication between people who knew things and people who made things, okay? The French called savant and fabricant. And what you see emerging everywhere are these societies, these clubs, these academies in which people come together. And there's probably some alcohol consumed. I can't guarantee there wasn't any, okay? But this happens in taverns, it happens in coffee houses, it happens in people's salons, and, probably many of the conversations were, as you might imagine, about gossip and things like that. But useful information was access. The most famous of these societies, of course, was the Lunar Society in Birmingham. But it is really just the tip of the iceberg. These societies exist at the end of the 18th century everywhere in England and in many places on the continent. It's where the Industrial Enlightenment comes together to carry out this project of access to knowledge that we can use to make society a better place. So, here's a good example of this. Masonic lodges. So the Masonic movement, today it seems to, as far as I know, it still exists, but it seems to have fallen hard times. But in the 18th century, it was really big, and many famous people belonged to it. Of course, Mozart was famous of these, but many of them did. And in these Masonic lodges, people met and had these conversations. So there are these networks, and I'm going to skip this because I'm running out of time, but people have talked about England as sort of an associational society in which people get together, strangers get together and talk to each other. All right, I'm starting to run out of time, but I want to give you one more point and then I'll leave it. And there's something called the Codification project, which is very much part of what I call the Industrial Enlightenment. So what is the Codification project? It means essentially we're going to codify, meaning write down knowledge that was previously transmitted only verbally. Most of that is, of course, artisanal knowledge. So an artisan, any kind of craftsman at this time, basically learned his or her trade from a master in an apprenticeship relationship. And this is tacit knowledge. Basically, how do you bake a bread? Well, here I'm baking a bread. Look how I'm doing it, and you learn it from me. But what they're starting to do in the 18th century is to codify this, to write down books that say, this is how you do it. And so, once you write these books, of course, you need to have the libraries in which people can have access to them. You need all kind of tricks so people can find things in books. So book indexes emerge. Books that are alphabetized by subject, encyclopedias and handbooks and things like that. And so this is a really big deal. And it is striking. I'm not totally sure why this is so. But actually more of this happening on the continent than in England. And then when the Continentals write these books, the Englishmen come back and translate them into English. So the most famous of these books, of course, I'm not going to actually talk about it, is the Grand Encyclopedia, the great Encyclopedia, edited by D'Alembert and Diderot, which is widely regarded to be the paradigmatic Enlightenment document. Now, it has much more in it than technology, but it has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of very carefully written articles about any trade that you can imagine, including the very famous diagram, which I don't have here, but you can all look it up, about pin making, in which you actually see the fine instruments that pin makers used to make pins. And of course, that is supposed to be the inspiration to the famous first chapter of Adam Smith's Wealth Nation. I'm going to show you something that's less well known than the Encyclopedia. This is the Description des Arts et Métiers. This is the descriptions of trades, and this comes out at about the same time. This is the first volume comes out in 1761. This is a huge project. I think there's altogether 82 volumes of it, of every trade you can imagine. In my younger days, I misspent them on reading about 12 of them. Extremely dull stuff, I must tell you, but this is what it looked like. So this is a typical picture of the codification project. So what is this? This is the lockmaker, like the locksmith. So you can sort of see the detail to which this is described. This is a artisanal trade which is now made accessible to somebody who has the book. Now, I'm not kidding myself saying, well, you just looked at this picture and you know how to make a lock. But if you already know something about a lock, this is a good guide to the state-of-the-art way of making locks at the time that this comes out. And here are two more books that come out at about the same time, part of the Codification project. The one on the right is a little bit later. This is 1808. This is written by a man called Augustin de Betancourt, who is actually Spanish, although he lived in France. And they just translate the title. This is an elementary course about machines. And this is a very good course, full of math, full of diagrams, that explains how machines actually work. And this is codification at its very best. Now, and all due respect to Monsieur Betancourt, he explains the steam engine. Now, he doesn't understand the steam engine because in 1808 they still hadn't figured this out. Okay, but the idea is we should make this knowledge accessible so that people can use it. Here is another one. This is about coal. It's written by a Frenchman called Morin. You can still see here, he's actually a doctor. Many of these guys were doctors, so they don't practice medicine. But this is about how to mine coal and how to use it, used for heating and for other domestic uses. So this is fairly early. This is 1770. This is written also in France, translated into English fairly quickly. So the English want to know how have we been doing, because English, obviously has far more coal mines than the French do. And so people have actually shown that these books made a difference. There's a famous piece of research by two economic historians, Maros Guicciarini and Nico Voigtland, that came out in 2015, that actually looks at this. And what they show is people who bought these books lived in towns that were growing faster. Now, what exactly was cause and effect here always remains a little bit questionable, although they do their best. But what they argued at is that these encyclopedias were associated with economic modernization and economic progress. And I think that's probably correct. Now, the British didn't quite have anything like the Grand Encyclopedia or the Description, but they had books like this. So this is much shorter, but it's a dictionary of arts and sciences. It's put together by a guy called Croker. But, here's the kind of things that they're dealing with. So many of these things are quite useful knowledge, anatomy and pharmacy, but also surgery and hydraulics and mechanics and pneumatics and on and on and on. Or even in medicine, here is this. This is also an English book published in 1740s. This is the famous medicinal dictionary. This thing, is published and republished for decades after decades after decades. Mark Twain still claimed that doctors used it, and of course make fun of it, because the knowledge in 1740s was, of course, very obsolete by that time. But it's immediately translated into French and read by, presumably, doctors at the time. Another part of the codification project. And you can also see then why patents were important, because they forced people to write down this thing. All right. So now, as I had another hour, I would tell you the evidence. Because, of course, this is economic history. We are nothing without the evidence. I'll just give you a brief survey of what people have been doing in the last decade or so. So they have basically done statistical testing of proxies to the level of technological creativity with these knowledge access institutions, as they call them. And what they find is that there's a very strong correlation across space and across time between the emergence of these institutions and the growth of technology, as measured by the number of patents and by the number of prizes won in these industrial exhibitions that become more and more common in the 19th century, and two, of course, are part of the industrial Enlightenment. So I have a huge number of tables. Oh yeah, maybe I'll show you this graph just for the heck of it. So these are what one scholar called these knowledge access institutions, or KAIs, and you can sort of see how these institutions are starting growing. This is actually fairly late. This happens only as the Industrial Revolution takes off. But these are these institutes and societies that emerged in Britain in the late 18th and early 19th century. This is Masonic lodges. So this is, you can see this is all over England, and this started actually fairly early on and so on. So, I'm looking at more, as you can see, there's a lot of statistical analysis here, which I'm going to spare you, but I do want to come, let me just say, this. All right, so conclusions. All right, sorry. Yep. So, as I said earlier on, the great divergence of income and living standards is and came out in the 18th century. What I have argued in somewhat different place is that it didn't all start with that. I mean, it goes back all the way to the Middle Ages, and the Industrial Revolution was not the beginning of Europe's exceptionalism, but its culmination. And that, I think, is a very big difference. But Prince Rasselas, whom I cited early on, was right. Useful knowledge matters, but we have to take the tools of the economist and the historian and the political scientist and the psychologist and ask how were Europeans able to augment and deploy this useful knowledge so that they became what they eventually became. And I think once we realize that, we can see how this particular slice of the Enlightenment is the key, not just to Europe's success, but to the fact that the rest of the world eventually was able to ride that wave later, less pronounced, with some areas regrettably left behind for one reason or another, but all the same, you go to places extremely remote from Europe, okay, first and foremost, of course, all China and India, and you realize that what made them rich, by and large, is a bunch of technical innovations that originated in Europe. Now, what about Britain? And so I would argue that the soils of the Industrial Revolution were planted, in which seeds of the Industrial Revolution were planted, was especially fertile in Britain. And yet, the seeds to many of these advances were planted, were in an ecosystem that was friendly to them. It was friendly because it was relatively peaceful, because people had property rights, because markets worked, and because compared to most other countries, the British were relatively free. And as such, it's still true that this particular phenomenon of the Enlightenment, when taking place in Britain, created economic modernity as we know it. Thank you.